Good evening, everybody. Welcome. I'm Todd Martin, the CEO of the International Tennis Hall of Fame. It is our pleasure to be hosting the second virtual program of February focused on the history of Black tennis. Tonight's program is Althea Gibson and the history of tennis. We're thrilled to have so many of you join us for what is certain to be an enlightening discussion. I would also like to thank Citizens Bank for their generous support of tonight's program. Over the past couple of years, the International Tennis Hall of Fame has embarked on several initiatives to better document and make accessible the history of Black tennis. In December, we launched our latest online digital exhibit, Breaking the Barriers, the ATA and Black Tennis Pioneers. Breaking the Barriers chronicles the stories, individuals, and memorable moments in Black tennis and its impact on both the sport and American history. I encourage all of you to visit the Hall of Fame's website, tennisfame.com, to learn about this history and those who made it. In 2017, the International Tennis Hall of Fame became the first independent sports museum to become a Smithsonian affiliate. This partnership provides the Hall of Fame a tremendous opportunity to share the resources and collaborate on research and programmatic initiatives. We are very excited to have a Smithsonian leader with us tonight as our guest speaker. We have also invited the Hall of Fame's own executive board member and former chair, president, and CEO of the USTA, Katrina Adams, fresh off her book release yesterday, Own the Arena, to introduce our esteemed guest and to moderate this evening's program. Katrina, congrats on the book release, and thank you as always for your dedication to tennis and the Hall of Fame. It's all yours.
Thanks, Todd. It is a pleasure to be here this evening, to be a part of this special program and to continue the dialogue of Black history and Black tennis and history. This is awesome. And, you know, when I think about Althea Gibson, who was our subject this evening, you know, a woman who was tall in stature and just fierce on the court and not so much off, but I had a chance to meet her when I was 10, again, later in life. But if it wasn't for what Althea did in breaking those barriers, I wouldn't be walking in her footsteps and had the opportunity to do what I've accomplished on the tennis court and be here with you all this evening. So it is truly my honor to be here. Damion, gosh, I'm honored to have this chat with you and really to hear what you have to present. Damion Thomas is the museum curator of sports for the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. He earned a PhD in United States history at UCLA. And prior to joining the museum, he was an assistant professor at the University of Maryland, College Park, and the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, where he taught courses that focus on sports in United States history, sports and U.S. race relations, and sports and Black masculinity. He is the author of Globetrotting, African American Athletes in Cold War Politics. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome you, Damion Thomas. Damion?
Thank you so much. It is an honor to be here. I'm excited to be part of these festivities, particularly as the Hall of Fame continues to find ways to celebrate and honor the legacies of African American tennis participants and their history. I want to start today by giving you an introduction to our museum. I know many of you haven't had the chance to visit. Then I'll share a bit of Althea Gibson's biography. And then lastly, I'll point out a number of items that we have in the Smithsonian collection that will help us better share Althea Gibson's story and legacy and place her within a larger context of US history and African American history. Can you load the PowerPoint slides? Right. One of the things that you'll notice, this is the entry to our sports gallery. And to the right, you see a statue of Tommy Smith, John Carlos, and Peter Norman. But to the left, you see our statues of Venus Williams, and Serena Williams. And we put those at the front of the gallery because we recognize the significance of women's sports, women's contributions, and in particular within the field of tennis and also beyond the court. So that's a nice entryway where we get a chance to kind of introduce people to these figures before they enter the gallery. Let's go to the next slide. Our museum took about 100 years to get built. The first attempt to get our museum built was in 1915, and that's an important year because that's the 50th anniversary of the end of the Civil War. And as the nation came back to Washington, D.C., and discussed the legacies and implications of the Civil War and the end of slavery and the Reconstruction period, African-American soldiers who fought in the Civil War also came back to DC and demanded that a monument and a memorial be built on the National Mall to honor the contributions of African Americans to American society. Unfortunately, their efforts were unsuccessful. There was another attempt in the late 1920s. Then this idea gained momentum in the 1960s. But with the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968, those efforts didn't bear fruit. Then in 1988, Congressman John Lewis from Atlanta introduced the legislation for our museum for the very first time. And he continued to introduce it every single congressional session until it was finally signed into law in 2003, and we opened in September 2016. One of the things that's interesting to note is that as you look at our museum, when you see this picture, you're only looking at half of our museum. The museum is 5 stories above ground and 5 stories below ground. And that's because, as many of you know, in Washington, D.C., you can only build buildings so high as to not block the views of the monuments. So we had to build below so that we could fit all of the stories into this space. Let's go to the next slide. The museum opened in September 2016, and this is the opening floor where we host a number of events. It's one of my favorite objects in the museum. That's a statue done by the great sculptor Richard Hunt. The museum has welcomed almost 7 million visitors since we opened, despite being closed for the last year. One of the things that we quickly learned was that people were spending much longer than we had anticipated. We thought that people would come to our museum and spend about 2 hours, and that's based on the average dwell time at a Smithsonian museum, which is about 90 minutes. We quickly learned that people were spending over 5 hours in our museum during their first visit. And so we learned that this is a history and knowledge that people were hungry to engage. And so we're very happy to see that. Let's go to the next slide. This statue right here, which is in one of my favorite galleries in the museum, gallery called Cultural Expression, which looks at Black identity and how it gets expressed through things like clothing and language and dance. In the center of this picture and in the center of this gallery is this statue. And if you look closely, if you look at the top of this statue, you see the 3-tiered crown. And that's the design inspiration for our museum. So it's really exciting to be able to have that on display so that people can see where that design inspiration came from. Let's go to the next slide. It's also important to think about the other design inspiration for our museum. When you see pictures of our museum, you'll often see pictures of the Washington Monument in the background. And that's important because it helps people learn where the museum is situated on the National Mall. But the other reason is that our museum is in an architectural conversation with the Washington Monument. If you look at the angles on our building, they're the same angles as the Washington Monument. The color contrast is important as well. And there are other features that the architect used to have this architectural conversation. Now, the Washington Monument is a symbol of America, a symbol of American ideas. We the people, all people created equal and endowed with certain inalienable rights. Among these, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In many ways, the African American experience serves as a way to see how closely the nation is living up to those values. And so because the African American experience is in conversation with American ideals, the architect, David Adage, wanted to ensure that that conversation was also reflected in the design of the building. Let's go to the next slide. This is a picture of the Oprah Winfrey Theater, where we host almost 200 events during a normal year. We host presentations and film screenings, discussions and book talks. It's named after Oprah Winfrey because she's the largest donor to the museum heretofore. She's donated $21 million to this museum. Our museum cost $540 million to build. Congress provided half of the funds, and then the museum had to raise the other half. And heretofore, we've raised about $500 million to help share this story to people all over the country and all over the world. Let's go to the next slide. This is a picture of our contemplative court. Our museum takes you from slavery to segregation to the modern era. And it can be emotionally draining. It can be a tough place to be in at certain points. And so we wanted to create a place for reflection, for meditation, for people. We wanted to create a place where people could sit and catch their breath and to think. And one of the things that we noticed is so many people come into this space and sort of ask the question, why haven't I learned this history before? Why didn't I know this? And so this has become an essential place in our museum. Let's go to the next slide. This is the image of Tommy Smith, John Carlos, and Peter Norman at the opening of the sports gallery. And I put this out here because I wanted people to know that this just wasn't going to be a gallery that deals with African Americans being able to run fast and jump high and win competitions. But rather, this is a gallery that uses sports to have larger political, social, and cultural conversations. And I wanted people to be aware of that from the very beginning. For me, the sports gallery isn't about sports. Rather, it's a gallery which attempts to share African American history through the lens of sports. And I think thus far we've been pretty successful at accomplishing our goal. Let's go to the next slide. In the museum, what we've done is organized by sport. We've got a room devoted to baseball. There's a room devoted to basketball, to boxing, to football, and to basketball. And we have a space devoted to golf and tennis. And I did that because in some ways I wanted to move away from the individual narrative in terms of how we think about history. But I also understand that the visitors come to the museum and they want to see individual stories. They want to see Jackie Robinson, Muhammad Ali, the Harlem Globetrotters, and others. And so we created this space to be able to focus in on those individual stories. This is our Game Changers hallway. And it is the Michael Jordan Game Changers hallway. And it's named after Michael Jordan because he is the largest donor from the sports world to our museum. He's donated $5 million to our museum. And so at the Smithsonian, $5 million, you get to name a hallway, and he chose this space. So I was really excited when he did that. So here we have a Game Changers case devoted to Althea Gibson. We only had 17 cases. And when I began to do this work, I had about 75 names that I wanted to feature here. And so it's really difficult to cut down. but I don't think we could have been taken seriously had we not devoted a space to Althea Gibson based on her accomplishments and her significance in African-American history and culture. Let's go to the next slide. So here's a side view of the Althea Gibson case. We have a tennis racket and a couple of medals of hers. And you can see that background image of her sitting in the car doing a ticker tape parade. And I'll show you a better picture of that in a couple of minutes. Let's go to the next slide. Here's an angled view where you can kind of see the entire case, where we tell 3 stories about Althea Gibson and her larger social and political significance. And I'll get to some of those as we continue through the presentation. Let's go to the next slide. Here's an image, a better image of Althea Gibson in a ticker tape parade in New York City in 1957 after she won the Wimbledon championship. What a monumental moment. It's interesting to think about her achieving this if we go back and think about her biography. Born in South Carolina in the late 1920s to sharecropping parents who were poor, who then decided to move up north during the Great Migration as African Americans were leaving the South in increasing numbers, looking for better opportunities in the North. And her family settled upon New York, where she was raised in her early years by her parents. She had a bit of trouble at home. She ran away a couple of times. She was in an abusive relationship with her father, who often sort of beat her for making minor childlike errors in terms of following her responsibilities as a kid. And so they had a difficult relationship. But it's in New York where she first gets introduced to tennis, where she gets an opportunity to play at the Cosmopolitan Club and gets to develop her skills. Drops out of high school, but then gets an opportunity to continue her career. And then she begins to play competitively in the ATA, the American Tennis Association. And then she goes on to have an incredible career where she won 5 singles Grand Slam events and 5 double events and a couple mixed double events. Just an incredible career. And with that start, who would have thought she would have ended up here being celebrated by the queens and presidents and all of America? But let's go to the next slide, because I want to delve a little bit deeper into some of these stories by sharing some of the objects that we have at the Smithsonian that help us tell her story. These are 2 events from the American Tennis Association, because African Americans weren't able to join the US Lawn Tennis Association. They created their own institution in 1916, and this became the first major African American sports organization. And through this organization, kids learned how to play tennis. Adults got an opportunity to come together, have their own tournaments. By the mid-1940s and 1950s, there were 150 African-American tennis clubs all across the world, all across the country, who competed in tournaments that were in their local communities. And then they held a big national tournament. And Althea Gibson really flourished because of her involvement in this space. It was a space where African Americans made a way out of no way. When they were barred from the larger organizations, they created parallel organizations that provided players with training. They provided players with a place where they could be in a welcomed environment. And it helped nurture thousands of kids who went on to get college scholarships, who learned the values and virtues of tennis and applied those to other areas of life. Let's go to the next slide. Because of her affiliation with the American Tennis Association, she met two of the major African-American benefactors, Doctors Hubert Eaton and Robert Johnson, who were adamant that they wanted to find and train African-American tennis players to break down the walls in tennis. And this is an important idea because tennis is different than football and basketball and baseball, which are middle-class sports. But the elite world of tennis, with its gentlemanly and ladylike qualities and its elite stature, became a really important and crucial space for African Americans to demonstrate that they could abide by those ideals and those notions. The emotional control that you had to display, even in the face of racial hostility. Because these men knew that the chance of Althea Gibson getting to the highest level was a daunting task. They often asked their players to play balls that were 2 inches out or less. They asked them to give any reasonable call, any disputed call to their opponent, because they wanted to ensure that as many doors could be open so that someone like Althea Gibson could come into the sport and rise to its highest levels. Let's go to the next slide. This is a medallion that was given to her by the government in Pakistan when she went on a US State Department goodwill tour of Southeast Asia, where she visited Pakistan, Burma, Thailand, and India, teaching the game of tennis, where she went with 3 other tennis players to help teach the sport. But there's also a backstory to this, because at the time, the US was battling the Soviet Union for influence in nations of color in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, who had recently gained their independence. And so as the US and the Soviet Union were fighting this battle for influence, US race relations became a major hindrance to US foreign policy, because the Soviets were able to say to nations of color around the world, why do you want to align with the United States when they treat their people of color in horrible and demeaning ways? And so the purpose of these tours was to send prosperous middle-class African Americans and integrated sports teams on these tours so that they could sort of shift public opinion about African Americans and about the level of equality and opportunity within the United States. While the State Department had its goal for sending Althea on this tour, she had her own goals in mind. Because she was, for the first time in regular competition with several elite players on the tour, she was able to develop her skills. And although she got a chance to play in the US National tournament in 1950, it's really not until after this tour that we really saw her blossom into being the dominant champion that she became. And she credits this tour with giving her the opportunity to focus in on tennis, to be able to kind of block out a lot of the distractions. And although this was a 6-week tour, she decided to stay abroad for an additional 6 months. And it's there where she became the first African-American to win a Grand Slam event, when she won the French tournament in 1956. And this propelled her on to her career, where she wins back-to-back Wimbledon and US Open championships in 1957 and 1958. So she's able to take this tour and to use it for her benefit. Let's go to the next slide. This is one of my favorite items in the sports gallery, and this is her Whiteman's Cup jacket from her participation in the 1958 Whiteman Cup Tennis Challenge. And the Whiteman Cup was a team tennis tournament between the US and Great Britain. And it was one of the most prestigious tennis tournaments of this particular era. And it was designed to be the women's counterpart to the Davis Cup, the men's Davis Cup tournament. And so this is the jacket that she got for her participation. And so really excited to be able to have that, because the Whiteman Club was one of the premier women's sporting events across all sports during this time. Let's go to the next slide. This is Althea Gibson's Wimbledon plate, championship plate from 1958. Now, this isn't in the National Museum of African American History and Culture. It's in our sister institution, the Smithsonian American History Museum, and she donated this to them in the 1980s or early 1990s. One of the ways you can tell that you really made it is when you are in multiple Smithsonian museums, and she's in at least 3 of them. And that's one of the great items in the entire Smithsonian collection. Let's go to the next slide. This is an image of her that's in the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery. As I said, she's in 3 Smithsonian museums. This is a major accomplishment. And to the left, you see the original piece of artwork that was featured on Time magazine during her reign as the champion and female athlete of the year. So that's exciting to have in the Smithsonian's collection as well. Let's go to the next slide. I put this tennis racket up here, which is from her career. It's later in her career, because it's interesting when we think about what her post-tennis career was like. She ended up leaving amateur tennis. Remember, in the 1950s, we're still 10 years before the Open era. She left amateur tennis as she was dominating the sport because she was looking for better financial opportunities. She thought that her success on the court would open some doors, would provide her with opportunities. And she got a couple. She got an opportunity to make a record. She unfortunately didn't sell well. She had 1 or 2 acting roles. She was able to use her tennis success to get a couple of opportunities, but she didn't have a lot of opportunities that came to other athletes of her caliber. Like, for example, she was never afforded the opportunity to be invited to be a tennis professional at a major club, able to teach tennis at many of the nice resorts and things of that nature. She did get some opportunities in the 1970s to develop tennis clinics that helped a number of African American athletes work on their skills and use tennis and use sports as a way to create better educational opportunities. She also was the first woman named as the state director of athletics when she held that post in New Jersey for 1 year in the mid 1970s. But unfortunately, she wasn't able to transform her success into wide scale commercial profitability. And unfortunately, that's the story of many African Americans from the 1950s and 60s who just didn't have all of the doors open to them. And so I just wanted to share a bit of her biography, some of the items that we have in our collection, and how we try to frame her vitally important and significant legacy. Thank you.
Damion, thank you so much for sharing that bit of history. Some we knew, some we didn't know. I was able to learn a few things myself. But let me ask you a question. We're going to have Q&A here. So people, if you want to start putting your questions in the Q&A tab, not the chat tab, please put them only in the Q&A tab. I will start to read them off shortly, but I'll kick things off here by asking you, Damion, when you think about the history of what Althea left behind in her legacy, How do you think it resonates to the modern day today, with the players today, with the tour, and understanding exactly what she had to overcome and just how talented she was when you mentioned not just tennis, but golf and acting and singing?
I think it's a really good question because I think a lot of the players are still dealing with some of the issues that she had to contend with. Like for example, like many of the great women athletes of the 1950s and 60s, their femininity was questioned. People questioned whether this was an appropriate space for women, whether this was something that had some negative impact on things from her physiology, her ability to have children, to to women's role in society. And I think we see some of the athletes still contending with that. She had issues finding sponsorship. Now, thankfully, there were a number of African Americans, people like Sugar Ray Robinson, Joe Louis, and Jackie Robinson, and others who would take up collections to help her get to the tournaments and have the time to prepare. But like so many other players were able to get sponsorships from other places, she struggled to do that. And that's the case still with the number of African Americans, people in the 80s and 90s. You often hear about these people who just could top 10 players who couldn't get the sponsorship in order to be able to train and compete on the highest levels. And so I think her struggles in some ways tell us how far we've come, but also still how far we have to go. While we've had a number of African Americans sort of playing, I'm still not sure that we've reached that level of a critical mass just yet, where race doesn't matter in the sport.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for that. So we have a few questions in our Q&A. I'll start with, not sure you know this answer. Who were Gibson's Grand Slam winning doubles and mixed doubles partners? Was it hard for her to find partners as an African American player? I can answer that if you want. I don't know all of her partners, but I know she won Wimbledon with Angela Buxton, Darlene Hart, and someone else. But yeah, it was very difficult for her to get a partner, because she was still seen as a Black person, and that wasn't really fully welcome in our sport, which was very, very unfortunate. Um, she also won Wimbledon with Maria Bueno. So hopefully that answered your question. Why was she able to make more money in golf? Why was that different?
That,
Go ahead.
that's a good question. Well, golf had a professional women's tour at that time, so there was more money in the women's golf tournament in the 1960s. She was a mid-tier professional golfer, and because she wasn't an elite golfer, she also had a hard time kind of making enough money through prize money, and also again finding the sponsorships to continue her career as a professional golfer.
Thank you. We have a question from, I apologize if I didn't mention your names earlier, but Sienna, was she involved in the civil rights movement in the 60s, and did she have much to say about those times?
That's a good question. In some ways, I think Althea Gibson was someone caught between two generations. And when we think about the 50s and 60s, we think of them as a protest generation, people sort of actively pushing and fighting for civil rights, protesting and marching. But if we think about the earlier generation, that generation of race men and race women who really thought that the best thing that they could do for the wider race was to achieve, was to break down barriers and to open doors. And in some ways, during Althea Gibson's time, we began to see a clash between those various generations. Now, Althea Gibson, coming up in the world of tennis, had been socialized into the philosophy of the race men and race women. Is that through her accomplishments and through her excellence, she would be able to change people's minds and perceptions and ideas. And it's also important to note that we also see a shift in this period in terms of how people are seeing racism. Because during the 40s and about midway through the 50s and 60s, people saw racism. And it comes out of this great book, very influential book by Gunnar Myrdal called The American Dilemma, where he said the race problem in America was about hearts and minds. And so your goal and your focus needs to be able changing the hearts and minds of white America. Whereas by the mid 60s, this idea becomes dominant, although we see it in the 50s as well, where when people are talking about race, they're talking about structural issues. The idea that the fact that African Americans have unequal access to education, you have a justice system that treats African Americans differently. So people are talking about a structural issue. And so I think in many ways she gets caught doing this generational shift in terms of ideas and beliefs. And like many other African Americans who come from that earlier period, they begin to get looked at as if they're not making a valuable contribution. People began to look at Jesse Owens differently. They began to look at Joe Louis differently. And in some way, she got caught up in that particular moment because she was not someone who was a protester, but really tried to use her accomplishments and her success and her ability to kind of abide by the very strict code of conduct in tennis as exemplary of what African Americans could do if you give us access to those ladylike, genteel, and elite spaces beyond the court.
Right. Thank you. Here's another question from Jeff. What do you suppose Althea would think of being in the Smithsonian or even have her statue on the grounds of the USTA Billie Jean King National Tennis Center?
I think that's a really good question. Althea donated a lot of her items from Wimbledon to the Smithsonian American History Museum in the 80s and 90s. And so I think she was someone who was interested in her legacy. And that's one of the things that I get to see as the curator of sports, is that when a lot of people start to get in their 60s and 70s, they begin to think about their legacy and how they want to be remembered. And one of the great joys of my job is I get a chance to go sit in people's living rooms and talk to them about what I think their contributions are to sports, but more significantly to African American history and to American history at large. Now, in terms of the statue at the U.S. Open, that is incredible. I got a chance to see it, and it's phenomenal. I would want to know what her response is to that statue and seeing herself and depicted in that way. I would assume it's something she never would have imagined. And I just want to thank Katrina for leading that effort to ensure that history is present in that sacred place in American tennis.
Yeah, it was my pleasure to be a part of that. Here's one from Kevin. If not for Althea, would Arthur Ashe achieved his breakthrough when he did in 1968?
That's a good question. Certainly, Arthur Ashe and Althea are connected, and her success made his path easier. There's no way of denying that. And I think, I don't know if you can say that he wouldn't have succeeded, but the model that she provided, the lessons that his mentors, Dr. Johnson and Dr. Eden, learned by being with her as she went through her journey, that they can apply to Arthur Ashe, the ways that they're able to protect him with that new knowledge that they gained, certainly is instrumental to Ashe's accomplishments, and I don't think we can deny that.
Thank you. Here's one from an anonymous attendee. How did the DC museums and the Hall of Fame acquire Ms. Gibson's items?
I'm glad you asked that question because it reminded me of something I wanted to mention. In particular, her nephew, Don Felder, has been someone who is committed to making sure that her legacy is preserved at the Smithsonian and in other places. And so it's really the dedication of her family who's taken upon themselves to find items from her career and to assemble them and to make sure that they go to the right places. Now, at the Smithsonian, we want to have a critical mass of items, but we also believe that her story needs to be shared in so many different places. So we've collected items, and we've also sort of helped think about other places that should also have items, because we want as many people in as many communities to be able to learn about her accomplishments and her place in history.
Great. Another question is, understanding and accepting that racism on the part of whites was a primary informative, it disappeared, sorry, it's so many coming in, here we go, formative aspect of her experience. Did she face conflicts and adversity from different cohorts of the Black community? It's from Matt.
Certainly. You know, as I said, she wasn't a protester, particularly as African Americans were moving into an era of protests. And so many people held that against her, that she wasn't a protester. She also had conflict with the Black press, who at times felt as if she wasn't as accommodating to their requests for access. And so those are two things that she had to contend with.
Thank you. Ooh, these are coming in rapidly. Alicia Chow, is the Smithsonian aware that there are efforts to make the house and tennis court where Althea Gibson trained, the home of International Tennis Hall of Fame inductee Dr. Robert Whirlwind Johnson, a museum? If so, is there a way that Smithsonian can assist financially?
I am aware of those efforts, and I really hope that they succeed. One of the challenges of the Smithsonian is a federal government entity, but we're also not one of the federal agencies that give money out. And so if there are ways that we could help support that effort, I would love to be part of those conversations. But we're also limited by what we can do in terms of helping to provide finances and things of that nature.
Do you know what year her book, I Always Want to Be Somebody, was written?
It came out in 1958 or 1950. I believe it's 1959.
Yeah, I have a copy. I just don't know what year that was. I saw that earlier. It was a quick one to ask. Erwin Shore, Althea Gibson attended the Wimbledon final that Zena Garrison played in because of the outpouring of public financial support to get her to Wimbledon since she couldn't afford the plane fare. Is that correct? Sorry, I read that kind of backwards, but I don't know that answer.
I'm not sure about that specific example, but Althea Gibson struggled financially in her later years. And there were efforts once people in the tennis world realized that she was suffering. She had suffered a stroke and was having some financial difficulty, and a number of people did reach out and provide economic assistance to her. And so it was really nice to see people recognize her contributions and want to help her, even as she had faded from the top of mind of most people in the tennis establishment.
Thank you for doing this presentation. Is there a book or hopefully books about her life that you recommend?
I think if you read her autobiography, I always wanted to be somebody. I think that's an incredible book. But there is a book, if you can wait, I think it's coming out a year or two, a brilliant young scholar named Ashley Brown at the University of Wisconsin is writing a biography of Althea Gibson that really will provide an updated analysis of her based on all of the things that we've learned. And so this is going to be an exciting book, and it'll be coming out really soon.
Great. This one is from Paul Newman. What was the impact among Black Americans generally of her success at Wimbledon in the 50s?
I think for African Americans, this is a crucial point where African Americans are sort of breaking down barriers in so many different places. And tennis is significant because it's an elite space. And so it becomes a metaphor, not only for, it becomes a metaphor not just for success on the tennis court, but it's a metaphor for all of the elite spaces. And what her success says to African Americans and for African Americans is that if you give us a chance to compete on terms of equality, this is what we can do in all of the elite spaces in American society. And so it's a tremendous symbolic victory that helps African Americans see potential.
Thank you. There's also another book called The Match that's out there. And another question in regards to a book that said there's so much, I'm glad you answered that to say there's a new one coming out, because there was another question saying that, you know, her book was written in the 50s or 60s, and there's so much more that happened in her life in tennis over those decades, and wanted to know the story and her opinions over that time.
The Match is a great book. I'm glad you mentioned that when it had slipped my mind.
Yeah, no, that was a good one. It's about that thick, but that's a good one. Can you tell me more about what you know about the lifelong friendship of Althea Gibson and Angela Buxton, who seem to have a community of being outsiders? This is from Julie Snyder.
I think you're right, is that Angela Buxton was also an outsider, and she was someone who recognized that in Althea Gibson. And it speaks to a lot of the kind of interracial coalitions which were taking place in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. And so it was an important partnership. You know, as we said earlier, they won tournaments together, but a support network in a sport where you are constantly traveling and dealing with ostracism from certain members on the tour, it's important to have those friendships, and we can see that they both benefited from that mutual support.
Yes, from Irwin Shore. Does Althea Gibson have any surviving family?
Yes, she does. She's got some nephews and nieces and other family members. I'm not sort of familiar with her entire family tree, but I've got a chance to speak with a couple of them who are committed to making sure that her legacy lives on.
I believe she has a sister that's still living as well. This is from John Begozin. Thanks, Damion. Great presentation. In this day and age of movies and videos, it seems that a film about Althea and what she achieved could be very powerful and inspiring. Are there any plans for such a film to be produced?
I'm not aware of a feature-length film, but I think you're right. That would be a great film. But there was a documentary film that came out about 3 years ago by Rex Miller. That's an incredible film. I learned so much from it, and I highly recommend that you go watch that. It was incredibly well done, and there's so many diverse voices there that really help us understand her significance and importance.
Yeah, and there is a film in the making right now that probably will come out in the next year or so. It's just seeking funding at this moment. You understand that. Francis Clayton Gray's Born to Win is also a good book to read about Althea Gibson. That was just thrown in there. And can you repeat the author of the forthcoming book again that you mentioned?
Ashley Brown. She's a professor in the history department at the University of Wisconsin.
Thank you. We got time for just a couple more questions here. Let's see. Her sister Lillian is still living. Thank you for that, Michelle Curry. Did Althea Gibson have any tennis rackets with her name on them?
I haven't seen any where she had a sponsorship deal, like a name tennis racket. I haven't seen those.
Yeah, I don't recall that. So that's a good question. Okay, so thank you, Denise Gray Felder. Yannick Rice is actually the writer for Born to Win. Thank you. Don Felder, with all film footage of Althea Gibson, her speed and agility, will there be video footage included in her exhibit at the museum?
We are working on collecting some footage, and that is a question that I've been working on for a long time. We've got to run some wiring and things, and we might be able to make it happen, and I hope we can.
Great. How do we ensure that Althea's went away? How do we ensure that Althea's amazing story becomes more well known?
That's a really good question, and it's up to us. It's up to the Hall of Fame. It's up to the museum. It's up to the scholars. It's up to tennis enthusiasts. It's up to the U.S. Tennis Association to ensure that her legacy and the legacy of other greats is preserved. And so I'm really happy that we at the Smithsonian are able to play our part.
Wonderful. Also, this is from Erwin Shore. I met Althea at the 1984 Summer Olympics that were held in Los Angeles when I worked on the tennis event. Oh, thanks. Sorry. I'll skip that one. It's a lot coming on in here. This is great. Black tennis players are still very few. Why is this, and what is being done to improve this? You don't really have that answer. I can answer that one. Go ahead. Go ahead, Damion.
Well, one is the cost of being a tennis player. It is estimated that it costs up to $30,000 to help fund an elite amateur tennis player. And so I think the cost is one of the major factors. But I'll defer to Katrina and her response.
No, I mean, it's we obviously have a great number of African-American or Black women on the tour that are doing really well. And I would say on the men's side, the other sports are really pulling them with, it's not so much the cost, but it's what they think they can make, financially in those other sports. And they get bullied by their friends and they go out to play more football and basketball, et cetera. There's no more talented group of athletes than the Black athlete. And so the opportunities are there, but they have to want to do it. And that's part of it. That's part of it in addition to the cost effect once you get to a competitive level, certainly. We have time for, I think, one or two more questions. What do you think she would think of Venus and Serena Williams today?
That's a really good question. And these are the kind of questions that get historians in trouble. But I'm going to offer a response. I think Althea Gibson would see her success herself in a lot of their on the court style of play. There's similarities there. I think in some ways their desire and ability to stand up for themselves is part of her legacy as well. And so I think she would see a lot of herself in both of them.
And I will end with one more. Did she suffer overt racial criticism and jeering at her events, like Black baseball players, for example?
Undoubtedly, she did. There were many tournaments that didn't allow her to play for much of her early amateur career. There were other places that made it a hostile environment, even when she was allowed to compete. And she was someone who was known as, particularly late in the mid 50s, when she started to have a little bit more success, is someone who was not easy to get along with. And a lot of that had to do with the hurdles that she had to overcome. And so even as she achieved success and people became nicer to her, there's still a long memory of a lot of the challenges that she had to overcome. And even as she succeeded, it was something that people tried to minimize or sort of claim that she had some physiological advantage. So even as she's succeeding, she's still facing a lot of unnecessary and critiques that invoke racist and sexist ideas.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you, everyone, for your questions. I'm sorry I wasn't able to get to all of them this evening, but I did notice that some of the questions that were being asked were being answered by someone else in that little chat. So maybe you have a minute or two to go back through that. But Damion, I want to thank you for sharing your time and your knowledge with us this evening about the Smithsonian African American Museum and Althea Gibson and what she means to the museum as well as to everyone else. I would also like to thank Citizen Bank once again for their generous support of tonight's program. Events like this presentation are made possible through generous support of the International Tennis Hall of Fame, which is a nonprofit organization. So donations may be made at tennisfame.com/lecture and are greatly appreciated to enable the Hall of Fame to continue these types of programs. And I'm very grateful for the International Tennis Hall of Fame to do the seminars and webinars that they've done here in February in Black History Month to bring more knowledge to all of us on our history in Black tennis. So thank you all and have a good night.